The night Deadwood burned, and the 6 months that rebuilt it, began with something small enough to hold in one hand. At about 2:30 in the morning on Friday, September 26, 1879, most of Deadwood was still under darkness. The roofs along Sherman Street were only dim shapes against the black hills. Storefronts had gone quiet hours earlier. A few lamps remained behind windows, and somewhere farther along the gulch, a horse might shift its weight beside a hitching rail, leather creaking softly in the cold air. Inside the Empire Bakery, between Lee and Deadwood Streets, the night was warmer. An oven held the last of its heat. Flour rested in pale dust on boards and shelves. The floor beneath it was dry wood, worn by boots and daily work. A coal oil lamp cast a modest circle of yellow light over the room, enough for hands to find a pan, a sack, or the edge of a work table before dawn. Then the lamp was knocked over. The surviving municipal account does not tell us who overturned it, and it is better to leave that person unnamed. Later stories have tried to place the blame on one worker or another, but the clearest record preserves only the action itself. Somewhere inside the frame bakery, the lamp tipped, the oil escaped, and fire found the boards beneath it. For a moment, the flame may have looked containable. That is one of the quiet contradictions at the heart of this story. The object was ordinary. The room was familiar. Nothing about a single fallen lamp suggested that, before the morning was over, more than 300 buildings would be gone. But this was Deadwood in 1879, and the town around the bakery had been built quickly. It had grown from the urgency of gold, trade, freight, lodging, meals, tools, animals, and men, arriving faster than streets or safety systems could fully absorb them. Along Sherman Street, walls stood close to other walls, roof lines crowded one another. A small fire did not have to cross open ground. It only had to reach the next dry surface. At roughly 2:30, the alarm was sounded. The sound entered a town not yet ready for morning. It carried beyond the bakery, past closed doors and upper rooms, past businesses whose owners believed they had several more hours before another working day began. Somewhere, blankets were thrown aside. Boots found the floor. Men belonging to Deadwood's volunteer fire companies began moving toward Sherman Street, while others stepped outside simply to understand what had disturbed the darkness. The first visible change was local. Light gathered in the bakery windows. Smoke pressed against the ceiling and found openings in the frame walls. The cool air near the doorway met the heat inside, feeding movement into the flame. What had been a quiet workroom became a place where every wooden surface mattered. The floorboards mattered. The wall studs mattered. Shelves, counters, roof timbers, sacks, paper, and anything touched by spilled oil mattered. A bakery was built to contain heat in its oven, but not to hold a loose flame spreading across its floor. And still, beyond the building, Deadwood remained mostly dark. That contrast would not last long. This is the story of the night Deadwood burned, but destruction is only its first half. The larger question begins after the fire has passed. Many mining camps of the American West rose quickly and vanished almost as quickly. A strike weakened, a road shifted, a company failed, or one hard season convinced people to move on. Fire could finish what uncertainty had already begun. Deadwood faced that possibility before sunrise. By then, the first rush of placer mining was already changing. The town had gained businesses, hotels, supply houses, workshops, saloons, homes, and organized services. Yet much of its commercial center still carried the physical character of a temporary camp. Timber was available. Wooden buildings could be raised quickly. A merchant could open sooner, begin earning sooner, and worry about permanence later. The fallen lamp forced that later moment to arrive all at once. In the hours ahead, the fire would leave the Empire Bakery and travel through streets that connected nearly every part of Deadwood's daily life. It would move from one business to another, toward intersections where people had to decide what could be saved and what had to be abandoned. It would reach places where tools, food, clothing, records, and private belongings had been stored behind thin wooden walls. But before following that path, it is worth remaining beside the first flame for another moment. Imagine the small circle of light on the flour-dusted floor. The lamp itself may have been bent or broken. Oil spread farther than the flame first appeared to reach. Heat climbed the nearest boards. Smoke thickened above the work tables. Whoever stood inside the bakery had only seconds to understand that the room had changed from a place of work into the starting point of an emergency. Outside, the street gave no warning of what it was about to become. Sherman Street was still a street of dark windows, uneven boards, hitching posts, wagon ruts, and buildings standing shoulder to shoulder. The bakery occupied one place among many. No one looking at it earlier that night would have seen a dividing line in Deadwood's history. Yet that is what the building would become. On one side of the line stood the first Deadwood, the town assembled from speed, timber, opportunity, and the expectation that fortunes might shift tomorrow. On the other stood a town that did not yet exist, one of heavier walls, brick fronts, stone foundations, repaired water systems, reopened counters, and owners willing to invest in a future they could not guarantee. It would take only a few hours to destroy much of the first town. It would take about 6 months to reveal the second. The difference between them began here, in a bakery before dawn, with low oven heat fading in one corner and uncontrolled fire growing in another. The alarm was already moving outward. Footsteps were coming closer. Equipment was being pulled toward Sherman Street, and as the first responders approached the glow, they were not yet facing only a burning bakery. They were facing the way Deadwood itself had been built, wall beside wall, roof beside roof, nearly all of it waiting in the dark. The fire companies were approaching a town that had been built almost entirely from what the hills and freight wagons could provide quickly. A few minutes earlier, before the alarm began carrying through the gulch, an early worker might have crossed the commercial district without noticing anything unusual. He would have stepped onto a wooden sidewalk raised above mud, wagon ruts, and uneven ground. His boots would have made a hollow sound beneath dark awnings. Above him, painted signs moved slightly on their brackets, stirred by cold air slipping between the buildings. The scent of pine was still present in much of Deadwood. Some timbers had weathered beneath dust, smoke, and mountain winters. But the town was young. Fresh repairs, additions, sheds, stairways, and fences appeared beside older structures that were themselves only a few years old. In places, the growth rings of the boards could still be seen beneath thin coats of paint. The worker passed one storefront, then another. There was barely enough open space between some buildings to walk through sideways. Roof edges approached one another across narrow gaps. A stovepipe emerged from an upper wall and turned toward the night. Another rose through a roof at an uncertain angle, its metal dark with soot. Inside those buildings, heat had been necessary. September nights in the Black Hills could turn cold, and every lodging house, shop, kitchen, office, and saloon needed some way to warm its rooms. Wood-burning stoves stood on floors that were often made of the same material they consumed. Sparks might escape through a loose joint. A hot pipe could rest too close to a partition. Ashes might be emptied before they were fully cold. Coal oil lamps added another kind of risk. They were useful, affordable, and ordinary. They stood on counters, work tables, bedside furniture, and shelves. Their glass chimneys required cleaning. Their fuel had to be carried and stored. When placed securely, they made the working day longer. When broken or overturned, they could turn light into something far less manageable. None of this made Deadwood uniquely careless. These were common realities in towns throughout the 19th century West. What made Deadwood especially vulnerable was the density created by its rapid growth. The settlement had expanded with the Black Hills gold rush, after prospectors entered a region that had been guaranteed to the Lakota under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The rush did not develop on empty land, and the prosperity that filled Deadwood streets came through a larger history of broken agreements, invasion, and displacement. That truth belongs beside the familiar stories of mining claims and frontier business, because the town's speed of growth cannot be separated from the sudden movement of outsiders into the Black Hills. By 1879, the first fever of placer gold was already changing, but the town it had produced remained crowded. Miners still needed supplies. Teamsters arrived with freight. Travelers wanted beds and meals. Merchants needed places to store sacks, boxes, barrels, cloth, tools, and paper records. Builders responded quickly, because delay meant lost trade. A frame building could rise in a short time. Posts were set. Studs were fixed between them. Pine boards closed the exterior. A false front could make a narrow business appear larger from the roadway. Another floor might be added when rooms were needed. A lean-to could fill the remaining strip beside a wall. Each choice made sense by itself. Together, they created a town in which one building often depended on the next building remaining safe. The early worker continued beneath the awnings. He passed a closed door with warm air leaking through its lower edge. Somewhere inside, a stove still held coals. Farther along, smoke rose gently from a chimney and flattened into the cold air above the roofs. A loose shutter moved once, then settled. He may have been watching for trouble. Deadwood had night workers, watchmen, bakers, stable hands, hotel staff, and others whose hours did not follow the sun. Yet the danger around him was not hidden in a dark alley or carried by an unknown rider. It was built into the ordinary shape of the town. Wood beneath his feet, wood beside his shoulders, wood above his head. Even the sidewalks could carry fire from one frontage toward another. Awnings, porches, exterior stairs, fences, sheds, and stacked materials created smaller connections between larger structures. Where an open yard might have slowed a flame, Deadwood often offered another dry surface. The streets themselves were narrow because the gulch was narrow. Buildings pressed against the usable ground while the hills rose close behind them. Main Street followed the valley floor. Other roads climbed or crossed wherever terrain and property allowed. The result was practical for trade. It kept businesses near the traffic of wagons, horses, and pedestrians, but it also compressed the town's heat, smoke, and risk. Deadwood had not ignored the problem entirely. Volunteer fire organizations had begun to form during the late 1870s. Equipment had been acquired, including a hand-operated engine. Parts of an early water system were available. Men had accepted the responsibility of answering alarms, hauling hose, handling pumps, and protecting property that did not belong to them. That was an important change. It suggested that residents already saw Deadwood as more than a camp, where each person guarded only his own tent or cabin. Yet the safeguards were trying to catch a town that kept growing ahead of them. A hand engine had to be brought to the right place. Hose had to reach a useful water source. Streets had to remain passable. Men had to wake, dress, gather, and pull heavy equipment through darkness. Even when everything worked, water could defend only a limited section at a time. Construction had taken place everywhere at once. Fire protection could not. The worker on the sidewalk would have understood some of this without needing formal calculations. He could look up and see a stovepipe too near an eave. He could notice boxes stacked in a passageway. He could feel how little space separated one shop from the next. Perhaps he had seen smaller chimney fires, or heard alarms that ended before much damage was done. Most nights, the risks remained only possibilities. That is why towns learn to live beside them. A stove warms a room, so it stays lit. A lamp allows work before sunrise, so it is filled again. A merchant stores valuable goods close together, because space is expensive. A builder uses pine, because pine can be cut, carried, and raised before the next wagon brings another competitor into town. The choices accumulate quietly, then one of them changes the meaning of all the others. Near the Empire Bakery, the light was now stronger than any lamp should have been. It reached beyond the windows and began touching the neighboring frontage. Smoke gathered over Sherman Street, no longer rising in the narrow line of a chimney, but spreading beneath the roofs. The early worker stopped. The street he had crossed moments before was no longer simply a path between businesses. It was becoming a measure of how far the fire might travel. He could look in one direction and see dark storefronts still untouched. In the other, men were moving toward the bakery with the first pieces of firefighting equipment. Their problem was already visible. They had not arrived at one isolated structure standing in open ground. They had arrived at a tightly joined town of pine, warmed by stoves, lit by oil, filled with merchandise, and built in haste along a narrow mountain gulch. The bakery was burning. The block around it was waiting. The material ahead was stored for ordinary work. Somewhere inside a hardware business near the widening fire, shelves and counters held the practical objects required by a frontier town. There were nails sold by weight, hinges, lengths of chain, hand tools, stove parts, wire, lantern fittings, and supplies meant for mines, ranches, freight outfits, workshops, and new construction. There was also gunpowder. Its presence was not unusual. Powder had many uses in the Black Hills. Miners used explosives to open stubborn rock. Builders and road crews relied on blasting where picks and shovels were too slow. Hunters, prospectors, and travelers carried ammunition. A hardware store serving Deadwood could keep such material, because the settlement around it depended on work that often required force. On most days, the powder waited quietly behind the counter or inside a storage area. It had been packed, carried over long distances, unloaded from freight, counted as inventory, and placed where it could be sold when needed. That night, its meaning changed. The heat had already crossed from the original block into neighboring structures. It moved through walls that concealed what lay beyond them. Firefighters working outside could direct water toward roofs and frontages, but they could not see every storeroom, shelf, and closed container inside. A hardware shop looked solid from the roadway. Metal tools hung against walls. Iron goods rested in bins. Heavy objects seemed less vulnerable than cloth, paper, or dry foodstuffs. But the building holding them was still a frame structure. A man entering through the front would have found the familiar weight of merchandise all around him. Tools could be gathered, but only slowly. A crate of hardware resisted hurried movement. Loose nails spilled. Chains dragged across planks. Larger objects required 2 sets of hands and an open route to the door. The choice became narrower with each passing minute. Take the account books. Carry the cash box. Save the goods closest to the exit. Leave the heavier stock behind. Outside, rescued property was already being moved for a second time. The safe space near the storefronts had grown warmer. Boxes that had been placed in the roadway now stood too close to falling sparks and drifting embers. People lifted them again and carried them farther from the advancing line. The hardware store remained among the structures ahead. Smoke entered beneath the eaves and found the upper spaces. Heat gathered where the air could not easily escape. The front windows reflected light from across the roadway, making it difficult to tell whether the brightness came from outside or from something beginning within. A volunteer watched the roofline. Another adjusted the hose. Water struck the upper boards, ran through cracks, and fell from the awning in dark streams. For a brief moment, the frontage appeared cooler. Steam drifted away. Then smoke pushed outward again from a different opening. The official history does not identify the business, and it does not tell us how many containers of powder were stored inside. Later retellings have supplied names and exact numbers, but the municipal account preserves only the fact that matters here. The fire reached a hardware store containing gunpowder. That is enough to understand the decision facing those nearby. The powder could not simply be ignored, but reaching it may already have been impossible. Moving explosive material through a burning commercial block would have required time, clear access, and confidence that the containers were still cool enough to handle. Those conditions were disappearing, so the work shifted outward. People were drawn back from the closest area. Hose teams tried to maintain their position without standing directly before the threatened building. Goods lying near the frontage were removed where possible. The small open spaces between structures no longer offered protection. The town seemed to pause around one unseen storeroom. Then the powder ignited. The explosion was a brief event, but its consequence was larger than its duration. Pressure broke outward through the frame building. Burning material and fragments were carried beyond the place where the fire had been concentrated. Openings appeared where walls and roof sections had previously contained heat. The fire gained new reach. This was not the beginning of the disaster. The first block was already involved, and the volunteers already understood that the bakery could not be isolated. But the hardware store explosion altered the scale of the response. A line that had been difficult to hold became harder to define at all. Men working the hose drew back and repositioned. Equipment had to remain usable, even as the safest angle changed. A ladder that had been placed against one structure could no longer be trusted there. Buckets and tools left near the edge of the work area were gathered if they could be reached without exposing another person. No one had time to stop and measure how far the fragments had traveled. They could see the result. A roof beyond the first line began showing fire. Embers landed where no direct flame had yet arrived. Materials scattered by the blast created smaller burning points that demanded attention, while the main body of the fire continued forward. The volunteers now faced more than one problem at once. One stream of water could cool a wall. It could not cover an entire district. The physical limits of the equipment became clearer. A hand engine depended on coordinated labor. Hose had length, weight, and a fixed reach. Water pressure weakened with distance and poor positioning. Every relocation took effort, and every delay allowed the heat to settle into another structure. Still, the men continued to move the equipment rather than abandon it. Rope tightened again. Wheels turned through wet grit. The hose dragged across the roadway, its outer surface darkened by water and ash. Nearby, residents searched for another place to set down what they had saved. A chair, a trunk, a wrapped bundle, a set of tools, and several crates formed a temporary island of possessions in the darkness. When sparks began falling near them, the island moved farther away. That slow retreat showed how the fire was changing the town's geography. A place considered safe 5 minutes earlier was no longer safe. A doorway that had offered access was now blocked by heat. A building that had seemed separated from the original fire was glowing beneath its roof. The hardware store had contained objects meant to build, repair, cut, fasten, and open the earth. Its inventory represented the daily labor of Deadwood. Yet one part of that inventory had now helped the fire cross a boundary the volunteers were trying to preserve. The explosion did not decide the fate of the whole town by itself. No single moment did. Deadwood was lost in a chain of changing conditions: a fallen source of light, a frame building, adjoining roofs, stored merchandise, narrow spaces, limited water, and now powder reached by heat. Each consequence opened the way for another. The volunteers could no longer think only about the block around the Empire Bakery. The fire had begun moving through the commercial district, and the streets ahead would determine where people could work, where property could be carried, and which structures might still become a barrier. Beyond the smoke lay Lee Street. It was an ordinary intersection on every other morning. Before dawn on September 26th, it was becoming the first clear route by which the fire could enter the larger town. Lee Street lay beyond the smoke as a simple crossing of packed earth, timber sidewalks, storefronts, and wagon tracks. On an ordinary day, it helped move people through the commercial heart of Deadwood. Before dawn that morning, it began to serve a different purpose. It gave the fire direction. The explosion behind the hardware counter had scattered burning material beyond the first cluster of structures. Firefighters could no longer concentrate their work around one frontage. Small points of light appeared farther along the roofs, and the glow began stretching toward the intersection. A volunteer standing near the hose line could measure the change without any instrument. Earlier, he had faced the fire. Now he had to turn his head to take in its full width. The intersection offered a few precious yards of open ground. In a town built so closely, that mattered. Streets could sometimes act as breaks, separating one row of structures from another, long enough for water, axes, and coordinated labor to hold a boundary. But an intersection was not an empty field. Awnings reached toward the roadway. Elevated sidewalks continued along the storefronts. Hitching rails, signs, exterior stairways, stacked crates, and small sheds reduced the clean separation that firefighters needed. Heat could cross before direct flame arrived. Sparks required even less help. Men moved the hand engine into a more useful position. Its wheels pressed deep marks into wet grit as ropes were shifted and the equipment was turned. Hose followed in a heavy curve, scraping across stones and scattered debris. The volunteers had to keep the line open while residents and business owners carried property through the same limited space. Movement became the central problem. A wagon left too near the intersection could block the engine. A trunk placed in the wrong spot might catch a man's boot. A frightened horse could pull against its reins and close a passage that several people needed. Objects saved from one shop could not simply be dropped outside. They had to be taken far enough away that the advancing heat would not force another hurried move. A merchant emerged carrying a narrow wooden box against his chest. Another person followed with folded cloth or clothing gathered into a bundle. Someone else rolled a barrel away from a doorway, guiding it with both hands as it bumped over the edge of the sidewalk. Each person was making a private calculation. How much time remained? Which object mattered most? Was there still enough safety for one more trip inside? The answers changed from one building to the next. Near the front of the fire, water struck an upper wall and broke into shining drops. For several seconds, the darkened boards seemed to hold. Then smoke appeared at the roof edge above them. The heat had reached the structure from another angle. The hose team adjusted again. Their work was becoming less like extinguishing a single building and more like defending a line drawn across the town. Lee Street formed part of that line, though no one had chosen it in advance. Geography had chosen it for them. The municipal account would later trace the fire from Sherman Street along Lee Street toward Main Street. That route can sound simple when reduced to a sentence. On the ground, it was a sequence of small losses. One cornice began to smoke. One awning caught along its outer edge. One upper window brightened. One doorway was abandoned. Then the next structure became the place where everyone hoped the advance might stop. The intersection filled with layered sounds. Water struck timber. Axes cut into connecting boards. Wheels rolled over rough ground. Metal couplings shifted as the hose moved. Beneath it all came the lower sound of fire inside buildings, less dramatic than the falling material around it, but more constant. Smoke made distance difficult to judge. A person standing 20 yards from the nearest flame might feel protected for a moment, then receive a wave of heat as an opening appeared in a wall. The air could cool when smoke lifted, only to grow warm again when another roof section became involved. That uncertainty shaped every decision. The volunteers did not abandon the crossing. They searched instead for useful edges. A section of walkway could be pulled away. Loose material could be cleared from beside a building. Water could be directed toward siding not yet burning, buying time before the heat reached it from within. Axes were valuable because fire breaks had to be created with whatever space could still be found. Men cut at rails, steps, and smaller wooden connections. Each removed section widened the gap by only a little, but a little could matter. A length of timber came free and was dragged into the roadway. Behind it, the exposed side of the neighboring structure appeared pale for a moment, untouched beneath the smoke. Water reached that surface before flame did. Steam rose, and for a short interval, the wall remained intact. It was a small success, the kind that could not reverse the entire fire, but could preserve a route for another few minutes. Those minutes allowed more property to leave the shops near Lee Street. Account books, tools, clothing, small pieces of furniture, and boxes of merchandise accumulated farther from the intersection. Some items would later be found damaged by water, ash, or handling. Others would become the only surviving parts of businesses that had occupied complete buildings hours earlier. The roadway was becoming an outdoor storeroom for a town losing its rooms. Yet the larger movement continued. A roof on the far side of the intersection began to reflect the glow. At first, the light seemed to belong to the burning structures behind it. Then a thin line appeared beneath the eave. The hoped-for boundary had failed. Fire did not need to march evenly across Lee Street. Heat and embers had already gone ahead. By the time the visible edge arrived, the next section had begun preparing its own fuel. The hand engine remained in operation, but its position was becoming difficult to hold. Equipment was useful only while the crew could protect it. If surrounded, damaged, or cut off from water, it would become another heavy object trapped in the fire's path. The men began planning their retreat before they were forced into one. Hose was gathered where possible. The engine was turned toward a route that remained open. Residents were directed away from the most exposed side of the crossing, not through shouted speeches remembered by history, but through gestures, movement, and the plain example of those already carrying goods farther down the roadway. The commercial district was beginning to reorganize itself around the advancing fire. Safe ground moved ahead. Work followed it. Lee Street had once connected neighboring businesses. Now it separated what had already been lost from what people were still trying to defend. That distinction lasted only briefly, but for those standing there, it was the most important line in Deadwood. Beyond the intersection lay Main Street, the longer corridor running through the center of the gulch. Hotels, stores, workshops, lodging rooms, and entire communities depended upon it. If the fire reached that route, it would no longer be moving around the edge of the commercial district. It would be entering the town's main current. The volunteers pulled their equipment back by measured steps. Behind them, the last pale section of wall at Lee Street darkened under the heat. Ahead, Main Street waited in the smoke. Main Street received the fire as both a roadway and a gathering place. It ran through the floor of the gulch, connecting stores, lodging houses, workshops, eating places, freight yards, and smaller side streets. By daylight, much of Deadwood's movement passed along it. Wagons entered carrying food, tools, clothing, mail, building materials, and machinery. Residents crossed it to work, trade, eat, or return to rented rooms. In the hour before dawn, that familiar corridor was changing one section at a time. The first people farther down Main Street did not need to see the original fire to understand what was approaching. They could hear the alarm traveling through the commercial district. The darkness above the roofs had taken on a low orange color. Smoke arrived ahead of the nearest visible flame, carrying the smell of burned pine, coal oil, damp ash, and goods whose contents could no longer be identified. Along the lower part of Main Street stood Deadwood's Chinese district, a working neighborhood of businesses, homes, laundries, restaurants, shops, and lodging spaces. More than 200 Chinese immigrants lived in Deadwood during this period, forming an important part of the town's economy and everyday life. They were merchants, laborers, cooks, gardeners, laundry workers, and business owners. Their district was not separate from the life of the town. It was woven into it. Now the same route that carried customers and freight toward Lower Deadwood was carrying warning. A shopkeeper opened a rear storage space and began choosing what could be removed. Wooden boxes had been stacked there to conserve room. Some held clothing or imported goods. Others contained household objects, preserved food, tools, papers, or small pieces of merchandise purchased with months of work. The first box could be lifted. The second required another pair of hands. A third was too heavy to justify the time. That was how loss entered the district, not as one grand decision, but through many quiet judgments made beside shelves and doorways. A person could save what could be carried quickly, what could be replaced only with difficulty, or what contained the records needed to begin again. Everything else had to wait. Outside, bundles appeared along the roadway. Cloth was wrapped around personal belongings and tied into manageable loads. Wooden poles helped carry heavier containers between two people. Furniture was moved only when there was enough help and enough open ground. A chest dragged across a floor made a low scraping sound, then struck the edge of the raised sidewalk before being lowered into the road. Smoke settled in the narrow gulch. It did not remain high above the buildings. It moved between them, softening the outlines of signs and upper windows. Light from the advancing fire turned the haze brown and amber, so that objects appeared close and distant at the same time. People worked without knowing exactly how much time remained. That uncertainty made observation important. Someone near the upper end of the district watched the roofline rather than the roadway. Another person stood at an intersection and followed the movement of those retreating from Lee Street. The fire itself might still be hidden behind intervening structures, but its progress could be read in the behavior of the town. More residents arrived carrying goods. Firefighters repositioned farther back. The glow brightened. That was enough. Doors opened along Lower Main Street. Lamps were lit inside rooms that had been dark moments earlier. Not to begin a normal day, but to find clothing, money, papers, bedding, and objects that could be taken outside. In laundries, damp cloth and wash equipment offered a brief contrast to the dry commercial blocks farther uphill, yet the structures surrounding them remained vulnerable. Water in tubs could help with a small ember. It could not protect an entire frontage from sustained heat. A worker lifted a bundle of folded garments and carried it into the open air. The cloth pressed warm against the arms from the room it had occupied, then cooled quickly outside. Behind him, someone moved a wooden chair away from the doorway so others could pass. The path had to remain clear. That simple rule governed everything now. Saving possessions mattered, but blocking an exit could cost more than any object was worth. Crates were placed close to the edges of the roadway. Larger pieces were carried farther downhill. Horses were led away from hitching rails before smoke and noise made them harder to control. The district began emptying from the inside outward. Counters remained in place. Shelves remained attached to walls. Stoves, wash equipment, tables, and heavy trunks were left behind, because they could not move as quickly as people needed to move. Some goods were passed from hand to hand. There was no need for a formal exchange or a remembered speech. One person received the weight, adjusted a grip, and carried it farther. Another returned toward the buildings. Cooperation appeared as action rather than ceremony. The fire reached Main Street unevenly. One frontage might still appear dark, while a roof behind it had begun to burn. A neighboring business could remain untouched for several minutes longer, because of a small gap, a damp surface, or the direction of heat. Those differences gave people time, but not certainty. A thin fall of embers began landing among the possessions placed outdoors. Hands brushed sparks from cloth. Boxes were shifted. A rolled mat or blanket that had seemed safe near the sidewalk was carried across the road, then farther downhill. Every movement traced the changing edge of danger, without requiring anyone to mark it on a map. The volunteer companies faced the same difficulty. Their equipment could not defend every side at once. The route from Sherman Street through Lee Street had already forced them to withdraw and turn. Main Street now opened a longer front, with more structures, more residents, and more property to protect. Water was directed toward the closest threatened roofs, but each stream represented a choice. Cooling one wall meant leaving another to buckets, axes, or whatever local effort could be assembled. Protecting the hose and engine also mattered, because losing them here would weaken every defense farther along the gulch. The fire had become a problem of priorities. Lower Deadwood revealed the human cost of those priorities more clearly than the first commercial blocks had. Here, a business and a home might occupy the same structure. Goods for sale stood near bedding, cooking utensils, family possessions, and personal papers. To lose the building could mean losing income and shelter together. Yet the people working there were not merely waiting to be overtaken. They were calculating, carrying, clearing routes, and preserving what could support life after morning. A small account book disappeared into a coat. A bundle was tied more tightly. A wooden box was lifted onto a handcart. The cart's wheels turned slowly under the load, making a narrow track through ash and dirt as it moved away from the approaching heat. For a few minutes, that handcart became a complete household or business in motion. Behind it, the district's familiar details remained visible through smoke: painted characters above a doorway, laundry lines, narrow rooms, signs, awnings, and shop entrances polished by daily use. These were not decorative pieces of an exotic quarter. They marked places where people had built routines, earned money, prepared meals, kept accounts, and made a life in a town that did not always treat them fairly. The fire made no distinction between those lives and the businesses farther uphill. It moved wherever the construction allowed. As the first nearby roof began to glow, the final loads were carried away from one entrance. The door was left open because no one intended to return through it. A few loose papers moved across the floor inside, stirred by the air drawn toward the rising heat. Then the upper edge of the structure brightened. The people nearest it stepped back, not in panic, but because the last useful moment for saving property had passed. Main Street had become more than a commercial route. It was now the line along which neighborhoods measured time, first by minutes available, then by buildings lost. And while the fire moved downhill through the center of the gulch, its light was also reaching higher ground, where residents on the slopes could look down and see how much of Deadwood had begun to burn. From the higher roads, the fire looked different. At the bottom of the gulch, people experienced it one doorway at a time. They felt the heat against a storefront, dragged a box across a threshold, or watched smoke gather beneath an awning. From the slopes above, those separate struggles began joining into a single widening glow. Homes and smaller buildings stood along William Street, Forest Avenue, Centennial Avenue, and the rising ground beyond the commercial center. The climb placed them farther from the place where the fire had started, but elevation did not guarantee safety. Timber construction continued uphill, and warm air from the burning district moved naturally toward higher ground. A resident stepped outside carrying a folded blanket over one arm. The air beside the house was cooler than the air below. Pine and damp earth still held the night's chill, yet the cold was interrupted by warm currents rising through the gulch, carrying ash and the smell of scorched lumber. From that height, Sherman Street could no longer be clearly separated from Lee Street. Individual signs and storefronts had disappeared behind smoke. The familiar pattern of the town remained visible only through larger shapes. A roof line, a row of windows, the dark opening of a cross street, and the moving points of people carrying lanterns or possessions away from the lower blocks. The resident watched for a moment, then placed the blanket around another bundle already resting near the road. That simple action showed that the hillside was no longer merely observing. Rooms were being emptied. Trunks were opened and reduced to what could be carried. Clothing was gathered without careful folding. Papers were placed inside coats or smaller cases. Bedding mattered, because the coming day would leave many people without their usual rooms. Tools mattered, because work might have to begin again somewhere else. A large piece of furniture was left where it stood. A small box was taken instead. The choice was practical. The steep roads made every load heavier, and anything removed from a house needed a destination. Carrying possessions uphill required effort. Moving downhill meant approaching the smoke. Residents looked for open ground, neighbors' yards, wider turns, or places where bundles could remain without blocking the passage of people and animals. Below them, the fire continued through the commercial district. Its light touched the undersides of the smoke, creating a low ceiling over the town. At times, the glow softened, and someone on the hillside might hope that the volunteers had found a boundary. Then another section brightened, and the smoke thickened once more. The route recorded afterward carried the fire beyond Lower Main Street and upward toward William Street, Forest Avenue, and Centennial Avenue. The movement was not a neat sweep across a map. It followed whatever connections the town offered: adjoining construction, sheds, fences, roofs, embers, and heated air. On the slopes, smaller gaps between structures sometimes bought time. That time had to be used. A horse was led from a stable before the animal became difficult to manage. Its hooves pressed into the dirt, and the halter rope tightened as it turned toward the brighter part of the gulch. The person leading it chose a different direction, guiding it uphill where the air remained clearer. Behind them, another resident carried a chair from a doorway and placed it beside a trunk. The chair was not valuable compared with the building, but it could be used immediately if the household spent the morning outdoors. In a disaster, usefulness often became a form of value. The hillside roads filled gradually, rather than all at once. People stood near what they had saved. Some returned for another load. Others remained where they were and watched the roofs below, waiting to learn whether moving again would be necessary. Waiting was a decision too. Leaving too early meant abandoning property that might survive. Waiting too long could close the safest route. No official order could reach every household with perfect timing, so residents judged the changes themselves. They watched where firefighters repositioned. They noticed which neighbors were packing. They felt the air warming. A few embers reached the upper ground before the main fire did. They settled on roofs, fences, dry grass, and stacked lumber. Most faded. Some required a boot, a wet cloth, or a bucket of water before they could disappear safely. A person standing beside a house might spend several minutes watching the gulch, then turn suddenly because a tiny orange point had appeared near the eave above his own head. The scale changed again. The great fire below could not be reached from there, but a single ember could. A ladder was raised against the side of a residence. Someone climbed with a bucket, checked the roof edge, and poured water across the threatened section. The boards darkened. Water ran downward in narrow lines and dripped onto the ground. For that house, the action worked. The ember went out. It was a small rescue, nearly invisible beside the burning commercial center. Yet the night was made of such moments. Not every structure was lost. Not every effort failed. The fire's path was broad, but it was never perfectly even. A short distance away, another building began to smoke from a place that could not be reached as easily. Residents moved their saved belongings again. Blankets and clothing were lifted first. A trunk followed between two people. The chair was left behind because the load had become too much for the rising road. As they climbed, the temperature changed by degrees. Cooler air waited farther from the gulch, but smoke still followed. Ash settled on shoulders and hair. The particles were light enough to drift, yet persistent enough to turn pale fabric gray. From the upper slope, the town's shape could now be read by firelight. The commercial corridor formed the brightest band. Side roads appeared and vanished beneath the haze. Roofs on the far side stood in silhouette. Beyond them, the Black Hills remained almost entirely dark, a quiet landscape surrounding a town that seemed much larger because it was burning. That contrast carried its own uncertainty. Deadwood had grown rapidly, but it still occupied only a narrow portion of the hills. Outside its crowded center lay forest, rock, trails, mining ground, scattered cabins, and long stretches of darkness. A person looking down could understand how easily the settlement might disappear from that landscape. Mining camps had vanished for less. A declining claim, a changed route, or a hard winter. could empty buildings without leaving dramatic ruins. Fire offered a faster ending. By dawn, Deadwood might appear to have reached the natural conclusion of a place constructed too quickly around uncertain wealth. But no one on the hillside could know that future yet. They could only watch the present advance. Along one of the higher roads, a final bundle was tied with rope. The knot was pulled tight. The person holding it looked downhill, judged the growing light, and chose not to return to the house. That choice marked another invisible boundary. The building still stood. The household had already left it behind. Farther down the slope, flames reached another roof. The orange line moved upward, caught beneath the edge, and spread across the dry surface. The people watching stepped back as the warm air reached them. For the first time, the fire below and the homes above seemed part of the same scene. The gulch was no longer divided between a burning business district and a safe hillside. The entire town had entered the night's uncertainty. Yet darkness was beginning to thin beyond the hills. Soon, the first gray light would reveal what firelight had hidden: the empty spaces between surviving walls, the streets buried under debris, and the true distance from the Empire Bakery to the last ruined block. The darkness thinned slowly, and the fire lost some of its power to hide what it had done. From the upper slopes, dawn first appeared as a pale gray edge above the black hills. It did not bring immediate warmth. The morning air remained cold, and the smoke resting in the gulch turned from black to brown, then to a dull silver as the light strengthened behind it. Below, the brightest flames had begun to settle. Isolated roofs and interior timbers still burned, but much of the commercial center no longer offered enough standing wood to produce the tall glow that had filled the night. What remained was lower and quieter. Coals glowed inside collapsed buildings. Cellars released slow columns of smoke. Water ran through ash and collected in shallow depressions along the roadway. The places where people had worked through the darkness were covered with broken boards, bent metal, fallen signs, fragments of glass, and goods damaged beyond recognition. The first residents returning toward the center had to move carefully. A man approached the place where his business had stood only hours earlier. He knew the location by habit, but habit was suddenly unreliable. The neighboring storefront was gone. The sign that had marked the corner was no longer hanging above the walkway. The roofline he had used as a reference had disappeared with the rest of the block. He stopped beside a row of foundation stones. One section remained darker than the others, protected for a time beneath a wall before the wall collapsed. Nearby, the iron edge of a stove protruded from the debris. A bent hinge lay in the roadway. Those few objects helped him place the doorway, then the counter, and finally the rear portion of the lot. The building was absent. The property still had a shape. That distinction would soon matter greatly. All around him, other residents were performing the same quiet work of recognition. They followed stone footings, cellar openings, surviving chimneys, fence lines, or the position of a crossing. A person might stand in an open space that now appeared much larger than before, and gradually understand that 3 or 4 businesses had occupied it the previous evening. The streets remained visible, though their edges had changed. Sherman Street could still be followed toward Lee. Main Street still ran through the center of the gulch. The root of the fire could now be traced not by light, but by absence. Where rows of structures had once narrowed the view, morning opened long sight lines across burned lots. More than 300 buildings had been destroyed. The figure was large enough to describe the disaster, but it could not fully explain what the town looked like at sunrise. A building might have contained a store below and rented rooms above. Another held a workshop, tools, records, and the owner's household possessions. A lodging house represented dozens of beds. A small shop could support an extended family or several employees. Official local accounts would estimate that approximately 2,000 people had been left without homes. Some stood beside the bundles they had saved. Others returned to find that the place where they had set down their belongings had also been reached by heat, sparks, or water. Blankets were gray with ash. Clothing smelled of smoke. Paper records had curled at the edges or become damp from the firefighting effort. The possessions in the roadway no longer looked like temporary piles. They were now what remained. A wooden trunk rested near the foundation of a lost building. Its surface was wet, and one corner had been blackened. The owner tested the lid, found it still closed, and dragged it a few feet onto clearer ground. The action was small, but it changed the morning. One useful object had been recovered from the confusion and placed where it could be guarded. Nearby, volunteers continued working. The end of the visible fire did not mean the end of the danger. Heat remained beneath debris. Cellars held burning material where water had difficulty reaching. A pile that appeared quiet could release smoke again when a board was moved and fresh air entered. The firefighters were also discovering how much of their own equipment had been lost. The hand engine had survived, but nearly everything around it had been placed at risk during the shifting defense of the town. Lengths of hose had burned. Bridges that carried routes and connections through the district were damaged or destroyed. Lead fittings at hydrants had melted in the heat, leaving parts of the water system useless where they were most needed. A firefighter lifted the end of a damaged hose. The outer covering had hardened and split. A section farther along had burned through completely. Water trapped inside escaped in a weak stream onto the ash, then disappeared into the dark ground. The tool that had carried water toward the fire could no longer hold it. This was another form of loss, less visible than a row of ruined businesses, but essential to Deadwood's future. The town had not only lost buildings, it had lost part of the system meant to protect whatever might be constructed in their place. The surviving engine stood among damaged fittings and burned lengths of hose, heavy, blackened, and temporarily limited by the absence of the equipment that made it useful. The volunteers who had pulled it through the night now had to consider repairs, replacement hose, new connections, and the possibility that another fire could begin before any of those needs were met. Morning did not offer rest. It offered an inventory. Residents counted people first. Then they counted property, tools, records, animals, rooms, stock, and usable equipment. Merchants searched through debris for metal cash boxes, safes, hardware, and objects that might survive heat even when the structures around them had not. Some discoveries brought relief. A document found inside a metal box could preserve ownership or credit. A set of tools might allow a tradesman to work elsewhere. A stove, though damaged, could be repaired. Foundation stones could be reused. A cellar might contain goods protected by earth and masonry, even while smoke continued to rise from it. Other discoveries ended hope. A ledger turned to ash could erase the written memory of debts and payments. Machinery bent by heat might cost more to restore than replace. Merchandise soaked by water and smoke could no longer be sold. A room once filled with household possessions could be reduced to nails, hinges, and unrecognizable metal. The morning became a series of such judgments. Useful, damaged, lost, possibly recoverable, too hot to approach. The most unsettling fires were the ones no longer visible from above. Beneath collapsed floors, material continued to burn in basements and cellars. Some of those underground fires would persist far beyond that first morning, smoldering for weeks and, according to local fire history, in certain places for months. The old town did not disappear in a single clean moment. It lingered beneath the reconstruction that was coming. For now, however, no one could be certain that reconstruction would come at all. Deadwood had suffered losses before. Businesses could fail, claims could weaken, freight costs could rise, and residents could leave for another opportunity. A disaster on this scale gave every person a reason to ask whether rebuilding made sense. The answer would not be given by the town as a single voice. It would emerge through separate decisions. A merchant would decide whether to reopen. A family would decide whether to remain through the coming cold. A lender would decide whether a burned business still deserved credit. A builder would decide whether the next wall should be wood, brick, or stone. Near the ruined commercial center, the man standing beside the foundation stones took another slow look across his lot. The doorway was gone, but he could still identify where it had been. The street frontage remained. The property line remained. Beneath the ash, the place still belonged to a map, an account, and a possible future. He could walk away from it, or he could begin clearing the ground. Across the burned district, that choice was being made again and again. Some people began clearing debris. Others gathered what remained and prepared to leave. The difference was not always visible at first. Two merchants might stand on neighboring lots, both covered in soot, both holding account books saved from the night, both facing foundations still warm beneath the morning air. One might see enough value in the location to begin again. The other might see only another risk added to losses already too large to carry. Neither decision was simple. A business in Deadwood depended on more than its building. It depended on stock, credit, freight connections, customers, employees, tools, records, and the owner's ability to survive until money began coming in again. Fire could remove several of those supports in a single night. A merchant might still own the lot but have nothing left to sell. Another might have saved most of his records but lost every shelf, counter, and crate. Someone with money elsewhere could rebuild quickly. Someone who had already borrowed heavily might find that the ruins had ended the business before the first shovel touched the ground. Near Main Street, a man stood beside a blackened foundation with a key in one hand. The key had opened the front door the previous evening. Now there was no door. Its teeth were dark with soot, and its purpose seemed to have disappeared with the lock. Yet the small piece of metal still connected him to the business that had occupied the lot. It marked ownership, routine, and a place where he had expected to return every morning. Beside his boot rested a damp ledger. The outer cover had curled from heat and water, but many pages remained readable. Inside were names, deliveries, amounts owed, payments received, and goods purchased on credit. The building was gone, but part of the business still existed in ink. He opened the book carefully. Paper that had survived fire could still tear from rough handling. He turned one page, then another, checking whether the figures near the back remained legible. The action answered a practical question. If the accounts survived, some relationships with suppliers and customers might survive as well. The key could no longer open anything. The ledger still could. Elsewhere, wagons were being loaded for departure. Bedding, trunks, tools, and rescued merchandise were tied down beneath canvas. Families who had spent the remaining hours of darkness outdoors now had to decide where they would sleep the following night. Some could stay with friends or relatives. Others could rent rooms in structures that had escaped the fire, though available space was suddenly scarce. For some residents, leaving Deadwood meant only traveling a few miles until conditions improved. For others, it meant not returning. Mining towns were accustomed to movement. People arrived because opportunity seemed close, then departed when another place promised more. The road out of Deadwood did not need to be explained to those who had followed roads into it. A wagon creaked forward through the morning. Its load was uneven, assembled from whatever had been saved, rather than from what would normally be packed for travel. A chair leg pressed against the canvas. A cooking pot hung from the rear. A trunk shifted slightly each time the wheels entered a rut. The wagon passed lots where other residents were already working with shovels and pry bars. That contrast defined the day. Departure moved in one direction. Rebuilding began in the other. Among those who chose to remain were the brothers W.E. and James Adams. Their banner grocery on Main Street had been destroyed, but the loss did not end their connection to Deadwood. A grocery served needs that continued even after disaster. People still required flour, coffee, preserved food, soap, candles, and other basic supplies. In fact, a burned town needed reliable merchants more urgently than a comfortable one. The Adams brothers would rebuild and return to business. Their decision was not proof that recovery was guaranteed. It was evidence that at least some merchants believed enough customers, freight, money, and future remained to justify beginning again. Other partnerships divided under the same pressure. James K.P. Miller and his business associate McPherson had also suffered losses. After the fire, their choices separated. McPherson left, while Miller remained and continued his life in Deadwood. The contrast should not be reduced to courage on one side and weakness on the other. A person's decision depended on resources, obligations, age, opportunity, debt, family, and confidence in the town's future. The fire gave people the same ruins but not the same options. Those who left carried away part of Deadwood's population, experience, and capital. Those who stayed accepted the cost of restoring what the town had lost. The man with the ledger closed it and placed it beneath his coat. He then bent to examine the edge of the foundation. The stones were still firm in places. Ash filled the spaces between them. Bent nails, broken glass, and small metal objects lay across the lot. Clearing it would require labor before construction could even begin. He picked up a length of burned timber. One end broke away under its own weight, leaving black dust on his gloves. The piece was useless and had to be moved aside. Another beam beneath it was damaged but solid enough to serve temporarily as a lever. That was how rebuilding first appeared, not as a new wall, as sorting. What could be reused? What had to be discarded? What could be sold for scrap? Which cellar remained safe to enter? Was the foundation strong enough to build upon, or would it need to be taken apart and reset? Each answer changed the cost. Around him, small piles began to form. Metal in one place, charred wood in another, stone left where it might be used again. The empty lot slowly became organized, and organization made the destruction seem less final. The first work was not impressive. It produced no storefront, roof, or sign. It simply made room. Yet that room was the beginning of Deadwood's recovery. A cleared pathway allowed a cart to enter. A sorted pile allowed usable material to be found. A readable account book allowed a merchant to contact suppliers. A surviving property line allowed a builder to know where the next frontage belonged. The town's future was being assembled from such practical details. Confidence also depended on what happened beneath the visible economy. Lenders had to decide whether to extend credit to businesses that had just disappeared. Freight companies had to judge whether deliveries would still be paid for. Owners with capital had to choose between investing in Deadwood or placing their money somewhere less damaged. Every person who began clearing a lot sent a quiet signal to the others. Someone intended to stay. One cleared property did not guarantee a rebuilt district, but several cleared properties changed the appearance of the morning. The ruins no longer looked only abandoned. They looked occupied by decisions. Shovels entered the ash. Carts removed debris. Ledgers were opened. Measurements began. By the following census, Deadwood would record a population of 3,777. The figure showed that the town had survived, though it also reflected the departures and changes that followed the fire. Recovery would not mean restoring every person, every business, or every feature of the earlier boomtown. It would mean creating a settlement that could continue without them. Near the edge of the lot, the old key was placed on top of a foundation stone. It had become less useful than the shovel leaning nearby, but the owner did not throw it away. Then he lifted the shovel and began clearing the place where the doorway had once stood. The next decision waited beneath the ash. If the business returned, should its walls rise quickly from wood as before, or should Deadwood build something heavier this time? The shovel cleared the place where the doorway had stood, but the ground beneath it raised a larger question. Should the doorway return to the same place? Across the burned commercial district, owners and builders had to decide whether Deadwood would be laid out again, as it had been before the fire, or whether the destruction offered a chance to draw an entirely different town across the gulch. The old route still answered most of that question. Sherman Street remained the way into the district where the fire had begun. Lee Street still connected it to the longer course of Main Street. The lower road continued toward Chinatown, while other routes climbed toward William Street, Forest Avenue, and Centennial Avenue. The structures had vanished from many lots. The pattern beneath them had not. Property lines still divided one parcel from the next. Cellars remained below the surface. Foundation stones marked former walls. Owners knew where their counters, doors, rear rooms, and storage areas had stood. Freight wagons also knew where to travel, because the same roads still followed the usable ground through the narrow gulch. To abandon that pattern would have required more than drawing cleaner lines on a map. Lots would need to be exchanged or purchased. Ownership questions would have to be settled. New grades might have to be cut into uneven ground. Businesses eager to reopen would be asked to wait while a more orderly town was planned around them. Deadwood did not have the luxury of waiting, so the road stayed. That decision would shape nearly everything that followed. On a cleared lot near the commercial center, 2 stakes were driven into the earth. A length of survey line was stretched between them, passing over ash, broken glass, and the edge of an old stone footing. One man held the line tight, while another checked its position against the lot boundary. The cord was thin. What it represented was not. On one side lay the neighboring property. On the other lay the future frontage of a business that did not yet exist. Behind it, measurements would determine the depth of the building, the position of its rear wall, and the amount of space left for an alley, yard, or service entrance. The measuring line followed the familiar boundary, but the wall planned beside it would not be familiar. Before the fire, a builder might have placed wooden posts along that mark, fixed lighter framing between them, and enclosed the structure with boards. The work could advance quickly. Lumber was easier to shape and lift than masonry. A skilled crew could make a frame storefront appear almost overnight. Now, the same speed seemed less attractive. Owners had seen what happened when neighboring buildings shared heat, sparks, and closely joined roof lines. Repeating the earlier construction would restore commerce, but it would also restore much of the physical weakness that had allowed the September fire to travel so far. The alternative required more labor. Stone foundations needed careful placement. Brick walls demanded mortar, straight courses, skilled hands, and time to gain height. Materials had to be delivered in quantities far heavier than the boards once used to close a frontage. A wagon carrying lumber could supply a surprising amount of wall. A wagon carrying brick moved slowly beneath its load. The difference could be heard as it entered the burned district. Wheels settled more deeply into the roadway. Axles worked under the weight. The team pulling the load moved at a patient pace while the bricks shifted against one another with a dull, compact sound. When the wagon stopped, each brick still had to be handled. One was lifted, then another, then hundreds more. That repetition gave the new Deadwood its form. Workers stacked the load close to the marked lot, taking care not to block the routes used by carts removing debris. The pile grew in straight, heavy rows. Its color stood out against the gray remains around it. For the first time since morning, the lot held more building material than ruin. This was the visible change. Clearing had created emptiness. Surveying gave that emptiness a boundary. Brick and stone began giving it intention. Not every replacement would be masonry, and not every owner possessed the money to build on the same scale. Temporary structures and wooden construction would still appear, where speed or limited capital demanded them. Yet along the commercial center, a broader choice was taking shape. Deadwood would reuse its old footprint while changing the substance standing upon it. That approach solved several problems at once. Merchants could return to known locations. Customers would understand where businesses belonged. Freight could continue using established routes. Property ownership remained recognizable. At the same time, heavier construction could reduce the chance that one accident would pass so easily from frontage to frontage. The roads would preserve continuity. The walls would announce change. Near the survey stakes, Workers began exposing more of the former foundation. Ash was shoveled away. Loose stones were lifted and tested. Some cracked when moved, showing that heat had weakened them. Others remained sound enough to use again. Each stone had to be judged rather than trusted. A damaged foundation hidden beneath a new wall would save time only until it failed. If the next building was meant to carry the weight of brick, its base had to be stronger than the structure that had occupied the lot before. The work descended before it rose. A shallow section was cleared. Uneven material was removed. Stones were reset where necessary. Mortar filled spaces that dry stacking could not secure. Only when the base sat firm could the first visible course begin. This was slower than placing timber on open ground. It was also the first evidence that Deadwood was planning beyond the coming winter. A temporary mining camp tended to spend its money where it could produce an immediate return. A roof kept out weather. A false front attracted customers. A rough addition created rentable space. Those improvements were useful, but they did not always assume that the town would remain important for decades. Masonry carried a different expectation. Brick could not be rolled up, disassembled easily, or loaded onto a wagon for the next rush. Stone foundations remained with the lot. Money placed into such a building was tied to Deadwood's future. That made construction an act of confidence, but not blind optimism. The town still depended on mining, freight, trade, credit, and the uncertain fortunes of the Black Hills. Residents knew that prosperity could change. The ruins around them were proof that even a busy commercial district could disappear in a few hours. Yet owners began investing anyway. Their reasoning was practical. Deadwood already served a wider region. Goods entered through it. Money passed through its banks, stores, hotels, and offices. Mining was becoming more organized and capital-intensive, moving beyond the first simple rush of men washing gravel in search of placer gold. A town supporting that economy needed durable places to conduct business. The first courses of masonry therefore carried more than structural weight. They supported the belief that Deadwood still had a role to play. Along Main Street, the change appeared in separate lots rather than as one coordinated ceremony. Here, a trench was being cleared. Farther down, stone had arrived. Across the way, survey lines marked the width of a future storefront. On another property, a temporary counter allowed business to resume, while the permanent building existed only on paper. The district was no longer a field of undivided destruction. It had become a collection of work sites. That transformation altered how people moved through it. Wagons now arrived with supplies instead of carrying only rescued possessions away. Carpenters built scaffolds and temporary shelters. Masons checked lines. Laborers sorted debris from usable material. Merchants stood near their lots and considered doors, windows, storage, and the position of counters that would eventually return. The same routes that had guided the fire were serving Reconstruction. Sherman Street carried tools toward the place where the night had begun. Lee Street brought workers and materials across the commercial center. Main Street once again became the town's central current, though its traffic now passed between foundation pits, stacked brick, stone piles, and open cellars. The streets had survived because they were empty spaces between buildings. Now they gave the new walls their order. At the measured lot, a mason spread mortar across the prepared foundation. The trowel moved in a short, practiced sweep. A brick was lowered into place, pressed gently, and adjusted against the survey line. The first brick seemed almost too small for the task. It did not resemble a storefront. It offered no shelter, held no merchandise, and earned no money. Yet its position determined where the next brick would rest, and where the entire wall would rise. The mason checked the line once more. Behind him, the old key still lay upon a foundation stone, darkened by soot, and no longer matched to any surviving lock. Ahead of him stood a single course of new masonry. The entrance would return near where it had always been, but the wall beside it would belong to a different Deadwood. That different Deadwood began at the height of a mason's hand. A brick rested on his palm, rough along the edges and heavier than its size suggested. It had already passed through several stages of labor before reaching the prepared foundation. Clay gathered and shaped, heat applied until the soft material hardened, then loading, transport, unloading, stacking, and finally another short journey from the pile to the wall. The mason turned it once, checking the surface. With the other hand, he drew his trowel through fresh mortar. The blade made a quiet scraping sound against the board. He spread a low ridge across the course below, lifted the brick, and pressed it into place. A small amount of mortar moved outward along the joint. The mason tapped the top gently with the handle of the trowel, bringing it level with the neighboring bricks. Then he removed the excess and reached for the next one. The motion appeared simple. Its meaning was not. Before the September fire, many commercial buildings in Deadwood had been designed around speed. Timber could be cut to length, carried by a few workers, and joined with nails. A frame wall rose lightly from the ground. Boards closed the space. A roof followed, then windows, doors, a painted front, and a sign announcing that business had begun. Brick changed the pace. Each piece was small, but a wall required thousands of them. Every course depended on the one below. Corners had to remain square. Openings for doors and windows needed planning before the masonry reached them. Mortar had to be mixed to a workable consistency, spread before it dried, and protected long enough to set. The material demanded patience. It also demanded money. A merchant choosing masonry was paying not only for brick or stone, but for transport, skilled labor, scaffolding, heavier foundations, mortar, and additional time before the building could fully serve its purpose. During that delay, the owner still needed income. Goods might be sold from a temporary counter, a tented space, a borrowed room, or another business willing to share its frontage. The permanent wall rose while daily trade continued around it. This made brick more than a construction choice. It became a calculation about the future. A wooden building could be useful even if a town's best years lasted only a short time. The investment might be recovered quickly through sales, rent, lodging, or entertainment. If the mining economy shifted, some parts of a frame structure could be taken apart, reused, or simply abandoned without sacrificing the amount required for a substantial masonry block. Brick resisted that kind of movement. Once placed in a wall, it belonged to the lot. The owner's money belonged there too. That did not mean masonry made Deadwood safe from all future fires. Wooden floors, roof structures, interior partitions, furniture, merchandise, coal oil lamps, and heating stoves could still burn inside a brick building. Flames could enter through windows or travel through shared roof spaces. Heat could crack stone, weaken mortar, or destroy everything contained between exterior walls. The new construction was more resistant. It was not invulnerable. That distinction mattered, because the purpose was not to promise that disaster would never return. The purpose was to slow it, contain it, and give firefighters a better chance than they had possessed on the morning of September 26th. A thick masonry wall did not offer fire the same easy passage as dry siding and closely joined wooden framing. It could stand between one business and the next, holding its shape while heat gathered on the opposite side. A row of such structures could divide a commercial district into stronger sections instead of allowing it to behave like one continuous body of fuel. The practical advantage could be imagined in minutes. A few more minutes to move records, a few more minutes to extend hose, a few more minutes to clear a neighboring room or defend a roof. The fire had shown Deadwood how valuable those minutes could be. The mason continued along the course. He selected another brick, rejected one with a damaged corner, and chose a sound piece from the stack. Each decision was small enough to escape notice from anyone passing nearby. Yet the durability of the finished wall depended on such judgments being repeated correctly. Bad brick was set aside. Uneven mortar was adjusted. The line was checked. The corner was measured again. Construction replaced urgency with sequence. Around the worksite, other kinds of labor continued. A cart brought sand or stone. A worker carried water for mixing mortar. Timber was cut for scaffolding, window frames, floor supports, and temporary braces. Even a brick building required wood. But now the timber was used within a structure whose outer form had greater resistance. The sounds were different from those of clearing ruins. Shovels still scraped the ground, but they were preparing foundations rather than searching through ash. Hammers struck nails for scaffolds. Trowels touched brick. Rope moved slowly through pulleys as material rose above shoulder height. The district was beginning to produce vertical lines again. For weeks, the cleared lots had made the commercial center feel open and exposed. A person could look across spaces that had once been blocked by businesses, lodging rooms, offices, and storerooms. Now walls interrupted those long views. At first, they reached only to the knee, then to the waist, then high enough that a worker standing on one side could no longer see the boots of someone on the other. The town was acquiring rooms before it acquired roofs. That change affected more than the owners who paid for the buildings. A rising wall gave neighboring merchants a reference point. It showed where a frontage would return. It suggested where a sidewalk might be rebuilt and how the next structure could meet the line. Most importantly, it showed that substantial construction was possible amid the damage. Confidence could spread through a town much as uncertainty did, one visible example at a time. A merchant who hesitated to invest might watch another foundation deepen and another course of brick gain height. A supplier could see that material sent to Deadwood would be used. A lender could recognize that buildings were moving beyond temporary shelter. A customer passing through the district could imagine stores returning to the empty lots. The masonry became evidence. Deadwood was not simply waiting to see whether the mining economy would continue. It was preparing buildings for that continuation. By then, mining in the Black Hills was already becoming more organized. The easiest placer deposits could not support every prospector indefinitely. Deeper and harder forms of mining demanded machinery, capital, stable supply networks, skilled labor, and businesses able to serve a more permanent regional economy. A temporary camp might sell picks and food to men passing through. A town expected to support companies, families, freight operations, offices, and long-term commerce. Brick suited the second future. The mason reached the end of the course and paused. He placed the trowel on the board, stepped back, and looked along the wall. From that angle, the individual pieces nearly disappeared. What remained was one straight horizontal line, held together by mortar and careful placement. One brick had meant little by itself. Together, they began defining permanence. The wall was still too low to shelter anyone. Cold air moved freely across it. No door could be locked, no shelves stocked, and no lamp placed safely behind a window. Yet the structure had advanced beyond intention. It now occupied space. Nearby, other masonry work was beginning to rise above the temporary roofs and open foundations. One commercial block in particular would soon provide Deadwood with its clearest proof that the rebuilt town could be larger, straighter, and more substantial than the one the fire had taken. Its name would seem almost inevitable after such a disaster. For now, it existed as brick, mortar, scaffolding, and a wall climbing steadily above Main Street. The wall climbing above Main Street belonged to a building that would soon be known as the Phoenix Block. Its name fit the moment so neatly that it almost seemed chosen by the town itself. Yet the importance of the building did not depend on the symbol. What mattered was visible in brick, mortar, timber scaffolding, and the steady rise of a commercial structure where the fire had left open ground. Deadwood's historic record identifies the Phoenix Block as the first brick building erected after the disaster of 1879. That distinction gave it a role larger than the businesses it would eventually contain. It became an early test of whether the plans made beside the ruins could survive contact with cost, weather, labor, and time. At first, the structure was little more than a foundation and several low courses. A person passing along Main Street could still look across the lot. Workers appeared from the waist upward behind the masonry. Stacks of unused brick stood nearby, their straight edges contrasting with the irregular piles of charred timber that had not yet been removed from neighboring properties. Then the walls rose above shoulder height. The view changed. For the first time since the fire, a substantial barrier occupied part of the commercial district. It interrupted the long open space left by the missing storefronts. It cast a shadow across ground that had remained exposed since the morning of September 26th. The Phoenix block was becoming real. A worker stood on a scaffold and received another load of brick raised by rope. The pulley creaked under the weight. Below him, someone steadied the line so the load would not swing against the unfinished wall. The bricks rose slowly. Nothing about the movement resembled the speed of fire. A few feet required repeated lifting, placing, checking, and waiting. Mortar needed time. The scaffold had to be adjusted as each new level became reachable. Openings for windows and doors had to remain straight, even as the surrounding masonry climbed. The labor was patient because the result was meant to be permanent. From the scaffold, a worker could look down Main Street and see several versions of Deadwood at once. There were foundations still blackened by the fire. There were temporary shelters and counters where merchants had resumed limited trade. There were wagons delivering stone, timber, sand, tools, and merchandise. And now there was a brick facade rising high enough to suggest the complete building it would become. The Phoenix block did not erase the ruins around it. It changed how those ruins were interpreted. An empty lot beside an abandoned town looks final. An empty lot beside an active construction site looks unfinished. That difference mattered to every person deciding whether to invest, lend, deliver, rent, or remain. A merchant considering reconstruction could stand across the roadway and watch skilled masons continue their work. A supplier could see that building materials sent into the gulch were not sitting unused. A teamster arriving with freight could observe customers and contractors moving through the district again. The structure created evidence where previously there had been only promises. It also gave neighboring owners something more practical, a new point of reference. The height of its floors suggested the scale of future commercial buildings. Its frontage helped restore the line of the roadway. Its masonry sidewalls showed how one substantial structure could separate interior spaces more effectively than the earlier continuous run of frame construction. The Phoenix block was not merely returning one business address. It was beginning to set the proportions of the rebuilt district. Construction brought its own daily decisions. If brick delivery slowed, work had to shift elsewhere. If the mortar became too stiff, it required adjustment. If a timber brace moved, the line above it could no longer be trusted until the support was corrected. Rain or cold could complicate work that depended on stable material and careful placement. A builder could not solve every problem by working faster. Sometimes the wall had to wait. That waiting was not inactivity. While masonry settled, carpenters prepared floor beams, window frames, roof members, and interior supports. Metalworkers supplied hinges, fasteners, brackets, and hardware. Laborers cleared access for the next wagon. Merchants considered how rooms would be divided once the shell could shelter them. Each trade entered the structure at a different stage. Together, they turned heavy outer walls into a functioning commercial block. The smell around the site began changing as well. Wet ash still lingered in nearby cellars, but fresh mortar brought a mineral scent to the air. Cut timber appeared again, now shaped for beams and scaffolds rather than thin exterior siding. Sawdust mixed with brick dust along the ground. Deadwood was beginning to smell like construction instead of destruction. The shift was gradual enough that residents might not notice it from one day to the next. But someone returning after several weeks would have seen a town transformed by accumulation. Another wall had gained height. Another foundation had been cleared. Another temporary counter had become a room. Another delivery of goods had arrived. The Phoenix block made that accumulation easy to measure because its upper edge kept moving. 1 week, the wall reached above the heads of workers on the ground. Later, windows opened as dark rectangles within the brickwork. Then beams crossed the interior. Scaffolding climbed again. The building began enclosing space. That was the true threshold. A foundation marked intention, and a low wall marked investment. But an enclosed room could once again protect goods, records, customers, and daily work from weather. It allowed the commercial life of the town to move indoors. Until then, much of Deadwood's recovery remained exposed beneath canvas, temporary roofs, or the open sky. The Phoenix block promised shelter of a more durable kind. Its name inevitably invited the image of rebirth from fire, but the actual process was less dramatic and more impressive. Nothing rose in a single moment. The building emerged through measured courses and ordinary labor. Its walls were not created from the ashes. They were built after the ashes had been shoveled away. That distinction preserves the human scale of the recovery. Deadwood did not return because disaster made it stronger by itself. It returned because people paid for materials, extended credit, transported heavy loads, drew measurements, mixed mortar, raised scaffolds, and repeated skilled actions until open ground became useful space again. The first brick building offered proof that those efforts could reach completion. As its facade gained height, the structure became visible from farther along the gulch. Someone approaching the center no longer saw only chimneys and temporary roofs above the work sites. A straight wall now stood among them, solid enough to catch the changing light of morning and evening. It did not resemble the frame storefronts lost in September. That was the point. The building belonged to the same main street, but it carried a different expectation of how long Deadwood might remain there. Other walls began rising nearby. Some followed the same preference for brick and stone. Others used combinations of materials suited to cost and purpose. The rebuilding was not perfectly uniform, but its direction had become clear. The commercial center was gaining weight, and as the Phoenix block rose above the temporary counters below, the recovery entered another stage. Deadwood no longer needed only walls that proved the town intended to stay. It needed shelves filled again, ledgers reopened, freight delivered, and customers stepping back across its thresholds. Before every permanent doorway was finished, trade began finding its way back. A freight wagon stopped beside a temporary counter on Main Street. The counter stood beneath a rough roof supported by fresh-cut posts, with canvas covering one side against the cold. Behind it, an unfinished masonry wall rose only partway toward the beams above. Gaps remained where windows would eventually be fitted, and the floor was still uneven beneath scattered sawdust and grit. The wagon carried ordinary things: crates of canned goods, sacks of flour, coffee, soap, candles, small necessities that could be sold one at a time but were needed across the entire town. A merchant placed the end of a pry bar beneath the lid of the first crate. The wood resisted, then lifted with a dry crack as the nails loosened. Inside, paper-wrapped goods had shifted slightly during the journey through the hills, but remained ready for sale. The merchant removed one package, checked it, and set it on the temporary shelving behind him. That single motion marked another stage in Deadwood's recovery. The earliest work after the fire had been concerned with survival. People searched for shelter, recovered possessions, counted losses, and decided whether to remain. The next stage had been physical: clearing lots, measuring boundaries, resetting foundations, and raising heavier walls. Now the town needed circulation. Supplies had to arrive. Money had to change hands. Credit had to be trusted again. A structure could stand empty for years and still contribute little to the life around it. A business returned only when its counters held goods and customers had reason to cross the threshold. The Adams brothers understood that need clearly. W.E. and James Adams had lost their banner grocery on Main Street in the September fire. Groceries were especially vulnerable because their value was divided among so many separate items. Flour, coffee, sugar, canned food, soap, candles, and other goods could fill an entire room, yet most were difficult to remove quickly when heat reached the building. What could not be carried away was lost with the store. Still, the demand for those supplies did not disappear when the roof fell. It increased. Workers clearing debris needed food. Families crowded into temporary rooms needed basic provisions. Builders, teamsters, miners, hotel keepers, and merchants all depended on a steady supply of goods entering the gulch. So the Adams brothers rebuilt and resumed business. Their decision shows why recovery could begin before the commercial district looked complete. A grocery did not need a polished facade to serve customers. It needed stock, a protected place to keep it, accurate accounts, and enough trust for suppliers to send the next shipment. Temporary arrangements filled the distance between destruction and permanence. A counter might stand beneath canvas. Goods might be stored in the safest completed room while work continued nearby. A merchant could conduct sales beside stacked lumber, mortarboards, or a doorway that had not yet received its final frame. Commerce returned around construction rather than waiting for it to end. At the temporary counter, the merchant opened another crate. The smell of coffee escaped as a package was lifted into the cool air. Nearby, a saw moved through timber with a steady pull. Farther inside the site, a hammer fitted a board into place. The sounds overlapped. Trade and rebuilding had become part of the same workday. A customer approached carrying an empty sack. The exchange required no ceremony. An amount was measured. The goods were placed into the sack. A figure was entered into the ledger, or paid across the counter. The purchase might have been small. Its consequences were not. The customer left with something needed at home or at work. The merchant gained money, or a recorded debt. Stock on the shelf became proof that another freight order could be justified. A supplier outside Deadwood gained reason to believe that shipments into the burned town would still find buyers. Recovery moved through such chains. A wagon delivered a crate because someone expected it to sell. The merchant opened the crate because customers still existed. The customer purchased from the merchant because leaving the gulch for basic goods would cost more time and effort. Each decision supported the others. Deadwood had always depended on connections beyond its immediate streets. The town did not produce every tool, piece of cloth, food item, lamp fitting, or construction supply required by its residents. Freight routes linked it to merchants, warehouses, farms, workshops, and transportation networks far beyond the Black Hills. The fire had damaged the local end of those connections. Reopened counters tied them together again. Teamsters began arriving not only with masonry supplies but with merchandise intended for daily use. A wagon might enter carrying food and leave with orders for the next trip. Another brought replacement tools, hardware, clothing, paper, or equipment needed by the mines and businesses surrounding the town. The old commercial routes regained their earlier purpose. During the fire, Main Street had served as a line of retreat. Possessions moved away from the heat. Fire companies pulled equipment through smoke. Residents searched for ground where rescued goods could be placed safely. Now movement reversed. Crates came in. Barrels rolled toward storerooms. Customers approached counters rather than leaving them behind. The roadway did not need to change direction for the town's fortunes to begin changing with it. Even so, the reopened businesses carried signs of what had happened. Merchandise was arranged more carefully where storage remained limited. Valuable records might be kept inside metal boxes or placed where they could be removed quickly. Owners watched heating equipment, stovepipes, lamps, and nearby construction with a new awareness. A merchant placing a coal oil lamp on a temporary counter could not regard it as entirely ordinary anymore. The lesson of September remained close. That lesson did not stop Deadwood from using flame, timber or crowded workspaces. A frontier town still needed light and heat. Builders still required lumber. Merchants still filled rooms with combustible goods. What changed was attention. The old habits now existed beside recent knowledge of their consequences. The Adams brothers, later Adams Block on Main Street, would provide a more substantial home for their business in 1880. But the commercial recovery did not wait for every major building to reach completion. It advanced through provisional rooms, borrowed spaces, open counters, and goods sold beneath the sound of continuing construction. That gave the town a layered appearance. One frontage might be complete enough for customers. The property beside it could still be a foundation trench. Across the road, laborers worked beneath scaffolding. A short distance away, a merchant conducted business under canvas while waiting for doors, glass, or roofing material. The district was unfinished but functional. That combination mattered more than appearance alone. A town could survive without elegant buildings for a time. It could not survive without food, tools, labor, money, and exchange. The counters restored those systems. They also brought people back into regular contact. Customers who had spent the first days after the fire searching for shelter now crossed paths while purchasing supplies. Contractors met teamsters. Merchants received news about incoming freight. Workers learned where labor was needed. Credit arrangements were renewed through repeated, ordinary transactions. The commercial center became social again, not because the disaster had been forgotten, but because daily needs refused to remain suspended. At the temporary grocery counter, the first crate had been emptied onto the shelves. The merchant folded the loose packing paper and placed it aside rather than discarding it. Materials still had value, and anything reusable could serve another purpose. He then opened the ledger. The pages were clean compared with the soot-darkened records rescued after the fire. A new entry was written beneath the date, marking a sale made in a business that was both temporary and already real. Outside, another freight wagon approached. Its wheels passed beside stacked brick, foundation stones, and lengths of hose left near the work of rebuilding the town's fire protection. Deadwood shops were returning. Now the systems meant to protect them would have to return as well. A town could raise walls and still remain only a construction site. To become Deadwood again, those walls needed doors that opened, shelves that held goods, ledgers that recorded debts, and counters across which ordinary business could pass from one hand to another. The change began before every storefront was finished. Along Main Street, a merchant worked inside a room that was still open to the sounds of masonry. One section of the exterior had been enclosed, but the doorway lacked its final trim, and cold air entered through window openings where glass had not yet been set. Fresh brick bordered one side of the room. On the other, rough boards formed a temporary partition against the neighboring worksite. A counter had been assembled from plain lumber. It was not polished. The boards did not match, and one corner rested on a wooden block to keep the surface level. Yet it created a clear division between stored goods and the customers beginning to return. Outside, a freight wagon slowed beside the entrance. The horses had pulled its load through the hills over roads used only weeks earlier, by people carrying possessions away from the fire. Now the same route brought replacements: flour, coffee, preserved food, candles, soap, cloth, household supplies, and the smaller necessities that allowed homes, hotels, kitchens, camps, and work crews to function. The driver set the brake. A worker lowered the wagon's rear board, and the unloading began. The first crate was manageable for one person. The next required two. A flour sack settled heavily across a shoulder and left pale dust on a coat already marked by construction grit. A barrel rolled down a short plank, its iron hoops touching the wood with a slow, hollow rhythm. Each item crossed the roadway and disappeared into the unfinished room. The merchant checked the shipment against a written order. A name, quantity, or price could not be left to memory when money was scarce, and replacement stock had traveled so far. He counted the packages, compared them with the ledger, and marked what had arrived. One crate was missing. Another contained fewer goods than expected. The shipment was still enough to open. That decision mattered. Waiting for perfect stock would leave customers without supplies and the merchant without income. So the available goods were placed where they could be seen and reached, while the missing items remained as notes in the account book for the next freight order. A pry bar entered beneath the lid of a wooden crate. The nails lifted gradually. The boards separated with a dry creak, releasing the smell of coffee, wrapping paper, and the closed interior of the box. Packages were removed one by one and placed on new shelves fixed against the temporary partition. Dust settled around them. A hammer sounded from the adjoining property. The store opened inside the noise of its own reconstruction. This was how Deadwood's commercial recovery advanced. Businesses did not wait for the entire district to appear complete. They returned in stages. A temporary roof came before a finished ceiling. A rough counter came before polished fittings. Goods entered before every opening held glass. For merchants such as W.E. and James Adams, waiting too long carried its own risk. The Adams brothers had lost the Banner Grocery on Main Street in the September fire. The destruction removed not only their premises but the stock that made the business useful. A grocery's value was spread across shelves, barrels, sacks, boxes, and countless individual goods. Much of it could not be removed quickly during a fire, but the demand for groceries survived. People still needed food after the disaster. Builders clearing lots required meals. Teamsters needed provisions for the road. Hotels and lodging houses still had guests and workers to feed. Households crowded into temporary quarters needed flour, coffee, soap, candles, and whatever could restore a small degree of routine. The loss of the grocery had not removed its customers. It had made their needs more immediate. The Adams brothers rebuilt and resumed trade, eventually opening the Adams Block on Main Street in 1880. Their recovery, however, was not contained in a single completed building. It began earlier, through decisions to order stock, restore credit, find usable space, and serve customers, while the district around them remained unfinished. The merchant behind the rough counter opened his ledger. Some transactions would be paid in coin. Others depended on credit. That required judgment. A familiar customer might have lost a room, a business, or an employer in the fire. Extending credit could help that person recover, but too many unpaid accounts could sink the store that offered it. Every entry carried uncertainty. A small amount of coffee was measured. Flour was weighed. A bar of soap and several candles were placed together on the counter. Coins touched the wood with a soft metallic sound. The transaction was modest, yet it restored several connections at once. A customer received necessary goods. The merchant recovered part of the cost of the shipment. The sale justified another order. The supplier who had sent merchandise into the gulch gained evidence that Deadwood still possessed a functioning market. One purchase supported the next delivery. That was how commerce rebuilt what masonry alone could not. The returning counters also served a region wider than the town. Mines required tools, food, clothing, rope, hardware, and replacement parts. Contractors needed materials and credit. Teamsters needed feed and provisions. Hotels depended on regular deliveries. Families living beyond the central district traveled into Deadwood because it remained the nearest place where many different needs could be met. The rebuilt commercial center was therefore more than a collection of local shops. It was a supply system for the northern Black Hills. Freight wagons proved that the system was reconnecting. They arrived carrying goods and departed with payments, orders, news, and requests for whatever the next journey should bring. A merchant who learned that several work crews needed the same item could increase the next order. A teamster could report road conditions, delays, or shortages before setting out again. Information moved with merchandise. So did confidence. Each wagon that reached Main Street suggested that suppliers expected Deadwood to remain. Each reopened counter suggested that merchants believed customers would continue to come. Each purchase suggested that people were building lives around the town rather than merely waiting to leave it. The change could be heard throughout the district. Crate lids were pried loose. Scales shifted under measured goods. Paper folded around small purchases. Ledger pages turned. Coins moved across unfinished wood while trowels and hammers continued nearby. The new buildings did not have to be silent before they could become useful. Inside one partially completed storefront, the day's stock slowly took its place. Flour sacks formed a row near the rear. Coffee and smaller goods occupied shelves above the counter. Candles were stored where they would remain dry. The ledger rested open beside an ink bottle, ready for another name and another amount. The room still smelled of mortar and cut lumber. By evening, it also smelled like a store. That was the visible consequence of the day's work. An empty interior had become a place of exchange. A freight load had become individual goods. A rough counter had become the point where Deadwood's wider economy entered daily life again. Outside, the wagon moved on toward another business. Its wheels passed near a hydrant whose fittings still carried marks from the fire. Coiled hose and replacement equipment rested nearby. Reminders that every new shelf, ledger, and shipment now required protection. Deadwood had learned how quickly commerce could vanish. As its counters returned, the town began rebuilding the means to defend them. The town's second reconstruction began beside a hydrant. Its outer surface still carried dark marks from the September fire. The lead fitting that had once joined it to the hose system had been damaged by heat, leaving the connection unreliable when the commercial district needed it most. Now a replacement coupling rested against the metal. A firefighter crouched beside it in the cold morning air and ran a gloved hand around the threads. Grit had collected in the grooves. He cleaned it away carefully, then lifted the coupling and turned it into place. The metal resisted at first. He backed it off, checked the alignment, and tried again. This time it seated evenly. Around him, construction continued. Hammers sounded from unfinished interiors. A wagon, loaded with stone, moved at a slow pace between work sites. Farther along Main Street, scaffolding rose beside walls that had gained another course since the previous day. Those investments needed more than masonry. They needed a system ready to respond before a small flame became another town-wide fire. The September disaster had damaged nearly everything required for that response. Hose had burned. Bridges and routes used by the equipment had been lost. Hydrant fittings had melted. The hand engine survived, but an engine without sound hose, dependable connections, and crews able to reach the right location remained only part of a fire department. So the rebuilding of Deadwood continued in canvas, leather, iron, and organized labor. A new section of hose lay coiled beside the repaired hydrant. The canvas was clean and pale compared with the blackened line examined after the fire. It felt stiff in the cold. Brass couplings at either end held the temperature of the morning, making them uncomfortable to grip without gloves. Two company members lifted the coil. One held the coupling near the hydrant while the other stepped backward, allowing the hose to unroll across the roadway. The canvas settled into a long, flat line between stacked brick and a temporary wooden storefront. The movement was unhurried. A twist hidden inside the hose could reduce the flow or strain the connection. So they straightened each section, checked the coupling, and made certain the line would fill without folding against itself. The first replacement hose had not all been purchased by Deadwood. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the neighboring town of Lead loaned 3 sections, each 50 feet long. The total was modest compared with the area that had burned, but those borrowed lengths restored something essential, while local equipment remained damaged. They gave the surviving engine reach. A 50-foot section could cross an intersection, extend around a corner, or allow a crew to stand farther from heat. 3 such sections created options that had not existed when burned hose lay useless beside the ruins. The borrowed equipment also showed that Deadwood's emergency system extended beyond its own boundaries. Lead and Deadwood were connected through mining, freight, labor, and the movement of people between the two communities. A major fire in one town affected confidence and safety across the northern Black Hills. Assistance, therefore, served more than goodwill. It protected a shared regional economy. A larger contribution followed. Sam McMasters of the Homestake Mining Company donated 500 feet of hose for strategic placement in the downtown area. 500 feet changed the scale of preparation. It allowed sections to be positioned closer to the places most likely to require them, instead of waiting for every length to arrive behind a cart from one central point. Crews could plan coverage through the rebuilt district. Main Street mattered. So did the crossings near Lee and Sherman. The lower commercial area mattered, as did routes leading toward the slopes. The same geography that had guided the fire now guided prevention. Company members walked the roadway and measured practical distances. They considered where a hose cart could turn, which intersections might become crowded, and how far a line could be extended before water pressure weakened or the route became too difficult to protect. This was not a perfect scientific plan drawn from complete knowledge. It was experience turned into preparation. They remembered where equipment had become trapped. They remembered where access had narrowed. They remembered how quickly one apparently safe position had become too warm to hold. Those lessons were now placed into the streets themselves. At the repaired hydrant, the coupling was tightened by hand and checked with a tool. The firefighter then stepped back while another man opened the connection gradually. The hose changed shape. At first it remained flat. Then water entered, moving through the canvas in a slow, swelling line. The section lifted slightly from the dirt as pressure traveled along its length. A small leak appeared near the coupling. The water gathered into a bead, then began running downward. The flow was stopped. The fitting came apart again. A washer was adjusted, the threads cleaned once more, and the connection remade. The task required only a few minutes, but those minutes mattered now, in calm daylight, when no roof was burning, and no crowd blocked the roadway. Preparation allowed mistakes to be corrected before they became consequences. The second test held. Water filled the hose without leaking at the joint. At the far end, the nozzle was opened briefly. A clear stream crossed the road and struck a pile of old foundation stones, darkening their surfaces before running into the gutter. The men watched the pressure. Then the valve closed. The line softened and settled. The hydrant worked. It was a quiet success, almost invisible beside the rising commercial blocks. Yet it meant that one part of the district had regained a defense it had lacked. After sunrise on September 26th, equipment alone was not enough. Someone had to maintain it, pull it through winter mud or snow, understand the hydrants, organize the carts, and arrive when the alarm sounded. That required companies, assignments, and a willingness to answer calls at any hour. On December 2nd, 1879, the South Deadwood Hose Company was organized. 8 days later, on December 10th, the Homestake Hose Company followed. The new organizations added people and structure to the rebuilt system. Hose carts and additional equipment gave crews a way to transport the lines through the district. Membership created responsibility. Someone inspected the hose. Someone watched the couplings. Someone knew where the cart stood and which route offered the fastest approach. The work was voluntary, but it could not be casual. Merchants now placing stock behind new counters had reason to support that discipline. Their heavier buildings represented larger investments than many of the frame stores lost in September. Shelves were filling again. Ledgers contained new credit. Freight had returned. A second uncontrolled fire would not merely repeat the old loss. It would destroy money placed into recovery itself. So fire protection became part of the commercial future. A shop owner could help fund equipment, support a company, keep access clear, or pay closer attention to lamps and stovepipes. Builders could avoid blocking hydrants and planned hose routes. Teamsters could learn where carts needed room to pass. The system depended on many ordinary choices being made before an alarm. That was its quiet strength. The rebuilt fire companies did not make Deadwood immune to future disaster. The town would face later fires, as well as floods and other damage. Brick walls could still contain wooden floors, roof structures, furniture, paper, and merchandise. Hose could freeze, tear, or fail. Hydrants could become difficult to reach, but the balance had changed. The old town had grown faster than its defenses. The new one was rebuilding those defenses, alongside its walls. Late in the day, the tested hose was drained. 2 men lifted one end and worked the remaining water forward so it would not freeze inside the canvas after dark. The line flattened gradually beneath their hands. Then they rolled it again. The coil was placed beside the cart, its brass coupling facing outward where it could be reached quickly. Nearby, the repaired hydrant stood ready against the edge of Main Street. Above it, scaffolding cast long shadows across fresh masonry. Cold weather was settling into the gulch, and the work had not stopped. Soon, masons, carpenters, merchants, and fire companies would all have to learn what rebuilding meant beneath snow, frozen ground, and the shortened light of a Black Hills winter. By winter, the pace of rebuilding could no longer be measured in hours. It had to be measured in mornings. On one frost-darkened lot near Main Street, workers arrived before the sun reached the bottom of the gulch. Their breath showed in the air as they stepped around stacked stone, scaffold poles, and a canvas-covered pile of materials. Overnight cold had stiffened the ropes and left a thin, white edge along the unfinished masonry. The wall stood higher than it had in autumn. It was not finished. A carpenter placed one gloved hand on the scaffold ladder before climbing. The timber felt cold even through leather. Above him, boards formed narrow working platforms against the brick face. Canvas had been tied along one side to soften the wind and protect part of the work from weather. The covering moved gently against the frame. A knot had loosened during the night. Before tools could be lifted or mortar prepared, the carpenter retied it. He drew the rope tight, tested the canvas with both hands, and watched until the fabric settled closer to the scaffold. Only then did the day's construction begin. That small delay belonged to the new rhythm of Deadwood. Fire had crossed the town in a single night. Reconstruction required weeks of repeated preparation. Tools had to be checked each morning. Materials needed protection. Frozen ground resisted shovels. Mortar work depended on temperature, timing, and care. Short daylight limited what could be completed before evening returned. Yet the work continued. Below the scaffold, laborers scraped loose debris into a cart. Pieces of charred timber still appeared among newer material, reminders that the earlier town had not vanished cleanly when the flames subsided. Nails, hinges, fragments of glass, and blackened hardware emerged from soil that had been disturbed many times since September. Each piece was lifted, judged, and placed. Metal for salvage, stone for possible reuse, ash and broken material for removal. The piles were smaller than they had been in the first days after the fire, but they had not disappeared. Rebuilding did not replace destruction all at once. The two existed beside each other for months. That was especially true below ground. From a damaged cellar nearby, a faint trace of smoke still entered the cold air. It did not rise in a dark column or suggest a new fire. It drifted thinly from a gap in the debris, almost invisible until sunlight touched it. Local fire history records that some basement fires continued for several months. The reason lay in the nature of the ruins. Cellars held collapsed floors, timber, merchandise, coal, ash, and enclosed pockets, where heat could remain long after the surface appeared quiet. Water did not reach every space equally. Removing debris sometimes allowed fresh air to enter and revive material that had never fully gone out. So the old fire lingered beneath the new work. A laborer approached the cellar opening with a shovel and iron bar. He paused first, feeling for warmth near the exposed edge. The air rising from below was noticeably softer than the cold surrounding it. He moved one board. A little more smoke appeared. The board was set aside, and the gap was left open while the area was checked. No one treated the faint heat as a mystery. It was another task to manage, another part of the old town that had to be cooled, cleared, and understood before the space could be trusted. A bucket of water was brought. It disappeared into the opening with a muted sound. The smoke weakened. Then the laborer returned to the cart. Above him, masons prepared the next course. Winter slowed some kinds of work, but could not stop the need for shelter and commerce. Temporary rooms still held stock behind canvas or unfinished walls. Merchants protected flour, paper, cloth, and other goods from dampness and cold. Stoves warmed completed sections where customers could enter, though heating equipment now received closer attention than it had before the fire. A shopkeeper arrived at his temporary counter carrying a pot of coffee. Steam rose from the lid as he crossed the roadway. He set the pot near the worksite, where several laborers warmed their hands around tin cups before returning to the scaffolds. The coffee offered a brief pause. Then the morning divided again into separate motions. A saw moved through timber. A shovel scraped frozen grit. A pulley lifted a small load. A mason tapped brick into alignment. None of those actions seemed large enough to rebuild a town. Repeated through winter, they did. The unfinished block changed by degrees. 1 week brought window frames. Another closed part of the roof. Floor beams appeared inside spaces that had previously been open from foundation to sky. A doorway gained its jamb, then hinges, then a door that could finally close against the cold. Each completed feature altered how the place could be used. Once a room held a roof and a door, goods could be moved out of temporary storage. Once windows were fitted, daylight entered without bringing wind and snow. Once a floor was laid, customers could step inside without walking across packed earth or planks placed over rough ground. The building became functional before it became polished. That pattern repeated along the commercial corridor. Some lots advanced quickly because owners had credit, materials, and crews ready. Others paused when money tightened or freight deliveries slowed. One facade might stand complete while the adjoining property remained under scaffold. A finished store could open beside a cellar still being cleared. The result was uneven but steady. Deadwood in winter was neither ruined nor fully rebuilt. It was occupied by transition. The same streets served carts hauling debris away and wagons bringing supplies in. Fire company members checked hose and hydrants while masons worked nearby. Merchants counted sales beneath roofs that still showed fresh lumber. Residents passed walls darkened by new mortar and cellars that continued releasing the last warmth of the September fire. The town had entered a season in which patience became visible. Winter tested every earlier decision. Brick and stone promised permanence, but only if labor could continue through cold mornings. Reopened shops promised economic recovery, but only if freight continued arriving and customers kept buying. New hose companies promised better protection, but only if equipment remained ready when freezing weather made every connection harder to use. Nothing maintained itself. A town intending to remain had to be attended to daily. On the scaffolded lot, the carpenter descended to adjust another brace. Frost had melted where morning sun reached the timber, leaving the surface damp. He tightened the fastener, tested the support with his weight, and stepped back. The platform above no longer shifted. Workers climbed again. Near the cellar opening, the last thin thread of smoke had nearly vanished. A dark patch of wet debris marked the place where water had been poured. The old fire was not entirely gone, but it had surrendered another small pocket of ground. The cart beside it was now full. 2 laborers lifted the handles and guided it toward Main Street. The wheel turned slowly through frost-softened ash, carrying away another load from the town that had burned. Behind them, the unfinished wall caught the pale winter light. It stood several feet higher than it had at the beginning of the month. That was how 6 months became believable, not through one dramatic rebuilding day, but through a long succession of cold tools, tightened ropes, cleared cellars, opened crates, completed rooms, and walls that gained height while winter passed around them. By the time the season began to loosen its hold on the gulch, the streets would still follow their old course, but almost everything standing along them would tell a different story. By the time winter loosened its hold on the gulch, the familiar route through town had acquired unfamiliar walls. A person entering Main Street roughly 6 months after the fire could still follow the same course through the commercial center. The crossings remained where memory expected them. Lee Street met the roadway at the old angle. Sherman Street still led toward the lots near the Empire Bakery's former site. Farther down, the route continued toward the Chinese district and the lower end of town. The map had survived. What stood upon it had changed. The walkers' boots passed over ground once buried beneath wet charcoal and fallen signs. On either side, new facades narrowed the view again. Brickwork rose where thin frame fronts had once stood. Stone foundations carried greater weight below. Window openings followed straighter lines, and substantial walls divided one property from the next. The lots were recognizable. The structures were not. At one address, the walker remembered a painted wooden front with an upper story that leaned slightly above the sidewalk. Now a masonry wall met the road with a firmer edge. Glazed windows held the morning light. A heavy door closed behind a customer with a sound deeper than the loose wooden doors of the earlier town. The difference could be heard. Footsteps beside brick returned a faint, contained echo. Wagon wheels rolled between harder surfaces, their noise held briefly within the rebuilt corridor. Hammers still sounded from properties where interior work continued, but they no longer belonged to a town made entirely of open lots and scaffolds. Rooms had returned, so had shadows. Only months earlier, sunrise had passed across the burned district without meeting many walls. Now the light moved over cornices, window frames, stonework, signs, and roofs. Chimney smoke rose from businesses where stoves warmed completed interiors. Merchandise stood behind glass instead of beneath canvas. Deadwood had regained its commercial shape. Official local history would remember that much of the burned center was rebuilt within approximately 6 months, with brick and stone replacing many of the wooden structures destroyed in September. The statement sounds almost immediate when written in a single line. Walking the district revealed what it truly meant. It meant 6 months of freight, 6 months of wages, 6 months of measurements, credit, cold tools, delayed deliveries, temporary counters, mortar, scaffolding, opened ledgers, and decisions repeated after the first confidence of autumn had been tested by winter. The town had not simply returned, it had been converted. Its earliest commercial architecture had reflected a rush. Many structures were intended to become useful as quickly as possible. False fronts created the appearance of height. Light framing reduced cost and labor. Rooms were added when demand required them, sometimes with little separation from neighboring roofs or walls. The rebuilt center reflected a different stage of the Black Hills economy. Mining had not vanished, but it was changing. The first placer excitement had already begun giving way to operations that required machinery, investment, organized labor, dependable freight, and longer planning. Those systems needed offices, supply houses, banks, hotels, workshops, and stores expected to remain in one location. A more capital-intensive mining region favored a more capital-intensive town. The masonry along Main Street belonged to that change. A brick block could not follow the next rumor of gold. Its foundations could not be loaded onto a wagon. The money placed into its walls assumed that customers, mines, families, and regional trade would continue to justify the expense. That assumption might still prove wrong, but it had become visible. The walker paused before one of the new storefronts and looked through the glass. Shelves stood against finished walls. A clerk worked behind a counter. An account book lay open near an ink bottle, while packages and household goods filled the space that months earlier had been exposed to the sky. The doorway occupied nearly the same position as the entrance lost in the fire. The business inside belonged to another version of Deadwood. A wagon passed behind the walker carrying supplies farther down the road. Its driver guided the team between a hose cart and stacked material waiting beside an unfinished property. The movement was familiar, yet the surroundings altered its meaning. Freight no longer entered a temporary camp whose future rested on the next season's luck alone. It entered a regional center, investing in its own continuation. That did not mean everyone had returned. Some residents who lost homes, stock, credit, or employment had left the gulch permanently. Partnerships had separated. Businesses had closed. Families had relocated. The first boom's population was already shifting before the fire, and Reconstruction could not reverse every departure. The census of 1880 recorded 3,777 residents. That number proved survival. It did not prove complete restoration. The new Deadwood contained absences that masonry could not fill. A rebuilt frontage might stand where a former owner had chosen not to return. A new tenant could occupy a lot associated with another business before September. A lodging room might shelter someone who had arrived after the disaster rather than the person who had lost it. Continuity existed beside replacement. The Chinese community in Lower Deadwood also remained part of the town's working life. Businesses and homes returned along the same broader corridor that had carried the fire toward Chinatown. Their presence mattered to the economy of the rebuilt settlement, just as it had before the night of destruction, even when later Western stories reduced or overlooked that part of the town. Recovery was shared unevenly, but it was not confined to one kind of resident or enterprise. Throughout the commercial center, doors opened for miners, laborers, merchants, cooks, teamsters, contractors, families, travelers, and hotel workers. The district functioned because all of them used it. The rebuilt town also carried new defensive habits. Hose rested where companies could reach it. Hydrant connections had been repaired. Volunteer organizations had clearer responsibilities. Merchants who had invested in stronger premises now watched more carefully over the systems intended to protect them. Masonry reduced the ease with which fire could travel. Preparation reduced the time required to answer it. Neither offered certainty. Deadwood would face later fires and floods. Buildings of brick and stone could still contain timber beams, floors, roofs, furniture, paper, cloth, and oil. Water could damage foundations. Heat could empty rooms even when exterior walls remained standing. The town had not defeated disaster. It had changed the terms of its encounter with it. The walker continued along Main Street. A finished facade stood beside another, still carrying scaffold marks. One doorway had new trim, while the neighboring entrance opened through a temporary board front. Recovery remained uneven enough to reveal its process. Yet the overall transformation was clear. The street no longer appeared to belong to a camp built in haste. Walls met the ground with weight. Doors closed firmly. Windows held warm lamplight after dusk. Chimneys released steady smoke into the colder air above the gulch. The commercial district had become more settled, more expensive, and more dependent on organized systems of credit, transport, mining, and public protection. Some of the restless energy of 1876 had passed. In its place stood a town making slower commitments. That was the answer to the question raised on the morning after the fire. Deadwood survived because enough people chose not merely to replace what had burned, but to invest in a settlement they expected to outlast the first rush. Merchants reopened. Builders raised heavier walls. Suppliers extended credit. Fire companies reorganized. Customers returned. Each action made the next one less uncertain. 6 months had not erased the destruction. They had given it a different consequence. At the end of the walk, the person turned and looked back along the line of Main Street. The route was the same one that had carried warning, smoke, retreating residents, and the glow of burning roofs through the darkness. Now wagons moved between brick and stone storefronts. The old town remained beneath them in foundations, Property lines, cellar walls, and remembered doorways, the new town stood above. And when evening settled once more into the Black Hills, the street would hold both Deadwoods at the same time, the wooden boomtown that had vanished before dawn, and the more permanent settlement that had taken 6 quiet months to rise in its place. Evening returned to the rebuilt town without ceremony. The last daylight withdrew from the slopes first, leaving the Black Hills dark above the roofs. Cooler air settled into the gulch. Chimney smoke thinned as it rose, and the sounds of work gave way to slower footsteps, closing doors, and the occasional movement of a wagon preparing for the night. Near Sherman Street, a lamp was lit behind a storefront window. Its flame was small and steady. 6 months earlier, another coal oil lamp had stood inside the Empire Bakery, only a short distance away. When that earlier lamp was knocked over, its oil reached the floor of a frame structure, and the fire found almost everything it needed in the surrounding town. The new lamp also held oil. It also depended on flame, but now its light rested behind glass and fell across a brick wall. The difference was not absolute safety. It was the result of everything Deadwood had chosen after the fire. A person walking from Sherman Street toward Lee could follow the same direction taken by the flames on September 26th. The route had not been hidden beneath a new plan. The intersections remained recognizable. Property lines still held the memory of older storefronts, and some cellar walls below the surface belonged partly to the town that had burned. Above those foundations stood heavier construction. The walker passed a doorway set within masonry. Its hinges carried the weight without sagging. The door closed firmly after a customer stepped outside, leaving muted voices and warm air behind it. Farther along, another window reflected the lamp, rather than revealing the room beyond. For a moment, the light seemed to float against the dark glass. Then the angle changed and shelves appeared inside, followed by a counter, an open ledger, and goods arranged for the following morning. The street had recovered its rooms. It had also recovered its boundaries. Where closely joined frame buildings had once allowed heat to travel through walls, roof spaces, and narrow gaps, brick and stone now interrupted the line more often. Fire could still enter a room, consume its contents, and damage the structure around it. But the rebuilt commercial blocks offered resistance that the first boomtown had rarely possessed. That resistance represented time. Time to reach a hydrant. Time to pull a hose cart into position. Time to move records, close a door, warn a neighboring business, or keep one interior fire from becoming the loss of an entire district. The town had paid heavily to gain those minutes. Yet Deadwood's later history would show that no material could remove every threat from such a place. More fires would come. Floods would rush through the narrow gulch. Water, mud, and debris could damage the same streets that flame had once crossed. Buildings would be repaired, altered, lost, or replaced again. The rebuilding of 1879 was not the final victory of permanence over disaster. There was no such victory. Its importance lay in the decision made before anyone could know what the following decades would bring. Deadwood continued. That answer had begun on the morning after the fire, when residents stood on ruined lots and decided whether to clear them. It continued when merchants ordered replacement stock, when lenders extended credit, when builders chose masonry, and when volunteers tested hose beside repaired hydrants. No single action saved the town. The pattern did. One person stayed. Another reopened. A wagon returned with supplies. A wall gained another course. A company organized. A customer crossed a temporary threshold and purchased what was needed. Those repeated choices turned survival from an idea into a physical place. By the time darkness settled over the rebuilt center, the transformation could be read along Main Street. Lamps glowed inside completed rooms. Horses stood near hitching rails. Wheels passed between substantial facades. A fire company cart waited where its crew could reach it. Behind upper windows, residents or travelers occupied rooms that had not existed when autumn began. The street still served the same practical purposes it always had. It carried food, tools, mail, money, workers, travelers, and news through the gulch. But it now carried proof as well. A person approaching Deadwood could see that the town expected another season, another year, and something beyond the immediate life of the mines. Its new buildings required that expectation. Their foundations reached too deeply, and their walls cost too much to belong only to a brief rush. Much of the recognizable historic character of downtown Deadwood would come from the construction era that followed the 1879 fire. The facades preserved in later generations were not simply remnants of the earliest camp. Many belonged to the more deliberate town that replaced it. That is why the fire altered more than a skyline. It divided Deadwood's physical history into two versions. The first town was quick, irregular, crowded, and largely wooden. It reflected the energy of discovery, migration, improvised commerce, and uncertain opportunity. It could expand rapidly because builders used what was available and placed usefulness ahead of endurance. The second town stood on the same route, but represented a slower confidence. Its walls required capital. Its businesses depended on organized freight and credit. Its fire protection required cooperation beyond the moment of emergency. Its mines were becoming part of a more settled industrial economy. Neither version was simple. The wooden Deadwood had not been merely careless. It had been built under the pressures of speed, terrain, supply, and sudden population growth. The masonry Deadwood was not perfectly safe or permanent. It remained vulnerable to fire, flood, economic change, and every uncertainty carried by a frontier town in a narrow mountain gulch. What separated them was intention. The first settlement had been built because people had arrived. The second was built because enough of them intended to remain. At Lee Street, the walker paused and looked back toward Sherman. The route was quiet now. There was no orange glow above the roofs, only the warm points of separate lamps held within separate rooms. One of those lights rested against a pane of glass framed by brick. Inside, a merchant lowered the flame for the night. The room dimmed slightly, though the lamp remained bright enough to illuminate the counter and the ledger placed upon it. Then the door was checked. The latch held. Outside, footsteps resumed toward Main Street. Their sound passed along the solid frontage, quieter with each step, until it blended with the distant movement of a horse and wagon farther down the gulch. Below the road lay the foundations of the town that had burned. Around the walker stood the town that had answered. The same streets remembered both.